Good morning, listener. Welcome back for our latest episode. This one is really fun for me because we actually have a local to me writer on our podcast today. So I got to hear Lara talk at a recent author talk hosted by our library. She is a former whitewater rafting guide in the Arkansas River, on the Arkansas River. She lives with her husband and 5 kids on their family farm here locally, where they raise over 300 Hereford mother cows and calves and grow over 30,000 bales of hay each summer. And her book is a great voice for land stewardship, sustainable beef production, and just the benefits of the family farm. She worked on a lot of the stories that are in this book through her 2021 program with Western Colorado University's MFA in nature writing. And this is her first published work called The Table, Seasons on a Colorado Ranch. And so I am so excited to have Lara Richardson here with us today to talk about this book. Now, I just finished the last chapter last night, or this morning, I mean, and I really enjoyed getting that look in farm life. You really take the reader through the entire process, right? Like what the reader gets immersed in what branding the calves looks like, and the illustration of the bulls, and the hay baling was like so descriptive and immersive in the way that you described, like that kind of like that pressure of like getting it right and keeping the line straight and counting the like sounds to make sure you have the right number of, I don't know if I'm using the right word, pallets in the bales. And I thoroughly enjoyed the way that you really just immersed me in farm life. And I had a little bit of minor experience from working on a goat farm and then having a small little hobby farm myself. So I could definitely relate to some parts of it, but other stuff like the hay baling was like very new to me. But you did such a skillful job in really describing the intricacies of that work and the reliance on the good weather and the sacrifices of everyone and the all hands in and the milkshakes. Like, what a delightful thing at the end of a workday to be brought a milkshake. I really enjoyed the way that you presented this. Do you mind talking a little bit about like how this book came to fruition out of your MFA program?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you so much for having me. Um, so when I started the MFA program at Western, they told us basically that our thesis would need to be a book length work. So whether that was nature writing, poetry, genre fiction, all these different categories. And I was in the nature writing program. And so simultaneously, while we were writing all these different papers and assignments and things like that, we were supposed to be creating this book that was going to be turned in as our thesis. And I quickly learned that I was not going to have the time to write a book as well as all these papers. And so I took each assignment that I was given and tried to create a common theme of the ranch or my family, or just something that I knew that I could pull from to create a book. And so that's kind of how it started out. So my thesis was a little shorter version of the book. But yeah, so I had to kind of, when I went to turn it in, I thought, none of this really flows very well. I had to kind of put a little bit of form to it. And so when I first put it all together, I put it together chronologically, and that didn't make any sense at all. And so then I redid it and used the structure of the seasons. And I think it works pretty well. It works better anyway than a chronological shape. So
I thought the seasons was genius. And I have to be honest, I did not appreciate the genius of the first chapter until I read the last chapter and realized that I could literally just turn back to page 1 and start the year over again. I was a little confused when I first read the beginning, like, why does she choose this moment to describe the table? I mean, she could have picked any moment, to describe the table and describe kind of the premise of this book and the seasons. Why is it here? I don't totally get why that was the case. But then I got to the last chapter, right? And it's like the opening of the chest at Christmas
Yeah.
time versus like the closing and packing away of Christmas at the beginning. And it was only then that I really appreciated just the pure like genius of like, I felt like I could just turn the calendar page, right? And be right back at the beginning of the book and go through a whole nother season on the ranch. So I really think the seasons worked, and I think you did a really good job of like when we hadn't read stories yet, or when we had already read that piece because it came in a different season. I didn't feel at all like I lost the chronological aspect of your life through the seasons, even
Yeah.
though those stories were thrown kind of out of mix. Like, there's a number of
Mhm.
times you reference that midnight phone call where you guys take Esther in, right? And so we
Yeah.
see that at one point, and then it gets referenced a couple more times, and then we get an even more like, the actual story of it later on. Same with like the references to Ruthie, where she's there and not there, and then there again, and then not there, and I never felt confused by any of that. You did a really good job of like
That's good.
helping me as the reader know that I'm jumping time without being like, oh, but I thought she has 5 kids. Oh, here she's just got the 4, older ones.
Yeah.
It all made sense to me. I think that was a great structure for this memoir to give us as outsiders to ranch life that kind of seasonal pacing.
Yeah.
And then you get
Well,
to have
thanks.
all this beautiful prose about the fact that seasons are fleeting and everything is temporary, and, you know, time changes and we just have to accept the change of it. So there's also all that beautiful imagery and metaphor you get to use because you've focused on the seasons. So I really thought it worked. I really did.
Well, thanks.
Um, I'm curious from a writing perspective, what went into the editing process and the changes that you had to go through in this, like the story beyond the structuring, the restructuring, when you decided to actually publish this book.
Yeah. Well, it's really exciting. Western Press Books picks one manuscript a year to publish, and so um, I threw mine in the pot, And when I got the email back from Steve Coughlin saying, "Hey, we picked the table," I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Okay, now all those papers that I thought were just going to be read by my professors and my writing cohort, who I, have a really tight relationship with, um, was going to become a book. And I was like, oh gosh. And so he goes, well, the first thing you need to do is make sure you just read it and that it's the book you want it to be. And I was like, oh gosh,
So
okay.
much
And so I read
pressure.
it. Yeah, with completely different eyes than I had before. Because it was one thing to submit it to somebody, but then another thing to say, "Oh, more people might read this than just them." And so, um, definitely went through and found a lot of errors, which I thought I had read it so many times, before I turned it in as a manuscript for my thesis, and then you find more. And of course, there's some in there now, that I keep finding, and you don't, I always think to myself, whenever I find an error in a book, I'm like, how could an author ever let there be, a mistake or a word misspelled? There's spell check and all this. And now I know.
I
So,
only found one, so I only noticed one.
well, and what's really fun is that the way the distribution and printing and everything works, whenever I find an
Yeah.
error, I can email and say, hey, if you print anymore, can you spell birthday correctly, or stuff like that. Like, oh, that's pretty bad. Anyway, so it was good. So the my editor went through the whole manuscript and obviously corrected some things, or addressed things for clarity, and or said, hey, can you unpack this a little bit more? And I would say the one area where he really challenged me, which I appreciated, was he basically said, um, okay, well, let me actually go back. One of my professors, when I was putting my thesis together, I said, hey, I'm struggling with like my faith aspect of this of this thesis. And her advice to me was, if you're going to write a Christian book, make it Christian enough. And if you're going to write a non-Christian book, don't make it too Christian-y kind of thing. And I was like, boy, I don't really know how to do that. My goal wasn't necessarily to write another Christian book. I wanted to write just something different. And so that was a challenge for me. And so it was really cool as my editor said, hey, I need you to complicate your faith a little bit. It feels really Pollyanna-ish to me. Like everything, oh, this is great, like everything's good, and life is great, and all that. And he said, I need to see your process a little bit more of how you cope with things, spiritually, if you're gonna put that in there. And so that was good. I had to revisit some sections and maybe be a little bit more honest with myself about things. And that was good. So
Uh, I'm I'm so impressed that you had like time to do a whole MFA program like in this world that you described in the book. And I know the book we talked before, only really goes up to your like pre-graduate school days. So I'm sure there had to be some adjustments
yeah.
or whatever. But as a writer and as a podcast for other writers, I'm curious about what did that look like different from what we see in this book once you were in your graduate program, like staying up late at night, getting papers done and books read, and how did you fit that into what seems like an already very, packed, important schedule
Yeah.
where like no single piece can fall to the wayside?
Yes. Yeah. That's a great question. My family really picked up a lot of slack for me, especially Andrew. Um, I would try and do the normal things on the ranch and dinner and, stuff with everybody. But then in the evening, he would just say, okay, go, we've got dishes. You go read, you go write, which is pretty dreamy as far as a writer goes, to be like, well, I've got to go write and read, because we're paying for it kind of thing. And so
Mhm.
it's almost like the time had to be carved out because it was a season and a real intentional time of being in school and paying tuition and, having grades and assignments and deadlines and things like that. So I think it was easier for me than it is now to sit down and write. Just like I haven't actually started writing other than doing this book work. But when I think about doing that without those, deadlines or really distinct goals, I think it would be a lot harder to um, ask everybody to kind of like, let mom's got to go read and write because she really likes it. you know, or she's like thinking about writing more kind of thing. So it was a really a season of a lot of staying up late or getting up really early, or I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd be like, oh, that's what I could write or whatever, and I would just get up and go start because the house is quiet and nobody needs me at that time, or like just setting my alarm every morning and just doing some clear writing because nothing else has hit me yet.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Like the
there's
morning
not
pages
really.
where you're
Yes, absolutely. And then the other thing that was just amazing was when everybody was off at school during the day, my father-in-law has a house up on Mount Chavannes up here, and it's kind of a family retreat sort of cabin. And so he would say, hey, you can go up there, go write. And so, because I would get really distracted at home, like, oh,
Mhm.
I could do some laundry real quick, and then I would go put dinner in, and then I would go do this, or, oh, he underneath this, or the cows are out, or, oh, could you jump on a baler, or, whatever. And it's like at some points during the day, I would just have to leave home because I would get too distracted or pulled in. And so I would go up there for a solid, 4 hours and just write. And I couldn't believe how quickly 3, 4 hours would go by with writing. And it was just, I felt really, it was very glorious. It was really nice. So I'd go take a hike in the middle, to move a little bit and get the
Mhm.
blood flowing, and then come back and write some more, and then come home and then feel like I had accomplished something. And then I'd maybe go revisit or have a Zoom class that night, that I had to prepare for. So it was definitely an intense time, but my family was super gracious and just picking up a lot of slack. So
That's great that you were able to have almost these little mini writers retreats within like your your daily life, because that's so true. That's what that whole thing you described with like, oh, but I should put dinner in the crock pot or I should move that laundry over or whatever is how I feel. Even though I've been able to carve out a space in my home that is like my dedicated like office, writing space, podcasting space, whatever. It's like there's so many other things that like even when I have time to sit down at the desk, it's like, oh, but I could get this started or I could do this or oh, that needs attention. Am I going to remember to do it later? No, I should just do it now. Let me just go ahead and get it over with so I can focus, you know? But to have
Yes.
a place where you can go beyond a coffee shop or somewhere that's going to be also very like stimulating or distracting. What a nice, thing and probably very necessary, like you said, in that kind of
Yes.
life where at any moment you could be sort of like, oh, we need extra hands, everyone available, come out, the cows are out, or,
Yes.
whatever.
Yes. Exactly. I did get distracted up there too. I'd be like, "Oh, I'm gonna go check all the mouse traps." Or um, one day one day there were all these plastic jars or like plastic containers of honey in the pantry, and I was making tea, and it
The
was in the
solid animal.
summer, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm gonna put them all in a hot water bath," and like just
Yeah.
have that going, and the whole house filled with the smell of like melting honey, and it was just beautiful. And then Andrew called, and he's like, "Hey, I need you to come down and do this, and then you can run back up." So I drove the 20 minutes down, came back up, and one of the windows to the house was like torn open, and I was terrified because at that point in time, we were trying to figure out if there was kind of a bad guy, abducting women in the valley, and I was like, "Oh no," and it turns out a bear had come in,
There.
and I'd like lured this bear into the house and come in, and like he took the big one plastic thing where I combined them all, and it was out on the ground, and it had all these teeth marks in it, and the dog food was all anyway. So I do get distracted up there.
Oh my goodness. Um, so when you were writing, or more so probably once you were deciding that this was going to be published and you were revisiting it for, a broader audience, how did you approach that struggle that a lot of memoirs have with knowing what is their story and what is someone else's story and what to include and what to leave out?
Yes. That is a great question, and I still don't know if I did that
I
correctly or
thought you did
not,
a really great job. Having read it, I
Wow.
know we talked about it before, but now that I've read it, like I really felt like you really walked that what is always a fine line between just giving the reader the proper understanding of what you're experiencing because of the way that our lives interact with others, but also having that
Yeah.
respect of, okay, and that part can be theirs. And here's
Yeah.
enough to understand what's going on and why I'm feeling what I'm feeling without, you know, showing what's underneath other people's rugs or in their closets.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, my family has some uh pretty crazy stories and people, and a lot of skeletons in our closet that I just didn't feel it would have been right to write about. And I really wanted to honor my family, but also be honest. And so um, I kind of dipped into those areas when I needed to, enough to create some understanding. But so a couple people I asked, I told you I talked to Esther's birth mom just about some details and things, and just said, "Hey, this is actually going to be a book now. Are you okay?" And sent her some different chapters that involved her, and it was really cool. She was like, "Hey, could you take this part out? Like, I don't really like that, or I'm not comfortable with that." And some people would say, "Oh, you don't need to do that. Like, that's your story and stuff." But I really wanted to honor her, and was really grateful that um she's a part of the story. And I wanted to like, with confidence and honor, hand her a copy of this book and feel really good about it inside. I needed to feel settled and have peace inside that I handled all of that really well. So yeah, I think I just had to kind of filter through. And actually, it was just so many of these began as papers for school, assignments. And so I wrote pretty freely with those and chose different topics and things. And I don't feel like I really had to change much, but it was important for me that certain people read the manuscript before I knew it was going to be out there. Like my father-in-law, just talking about Ruthie so much and Ruthie's passing and then of course Andrew, because the whole thing is about him and our family and our life and just making sure there wasn't something in there where he's like, well, I don't really want that in there, or, I think that was too much, he was really encouraging to me. He said, you have a perspective and you have a story to tell. And he said, all of these things affected you. And so he said, don't be sorry for telling your story. So, okay. So I went with
It,
that.
in sharing the stories, especially with Andrew, were there times where like he remembered something differently than you did? Because I've found that just memory can be so interesting and fickle, and it's our perspectives, but then we also overwrite it a lot of times. Um, did you guys like? Were there any points where he was like, "Oh, I totally didn't remember it that way. I think this happened first, and then it was this," and or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. No, I think he really enjoyed reading it. And I don't remember there ever being a time. Well, okay, there was one thing that didn't get correctly, and that's like the more technical things, like how many bales our stack wagon can carry at a time. Like I can't remember what I wrote originally. And he's like, well, that's not the right amount that it carries. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go change that one, So probably
Yeah,
more of the technical things, making sure I had that right, which is great.
yeah, for sure. Um, I had a couple. Okay, so I have to tell you, I don't know if it's something you learned in your MFA program. I don't know if it's something that you just naturally do as a writer, but I loved and have taken for myself the way that you carry on like an analogy or metaphor through like the verbs that you use. So I have an example. So when you're describing this is like the solar panel thing, and you're having this debate about
Mm.
whether might be worth selling a portion or leasing a portion of your land for these to put in the solar power, and what does that look like? And you visit this other farm where they've done that. And so this one sentence, the new crop of technology with rates of black cables hanging down would soon be planted into the grid. Like you did this numerous times throughout the book, and that's just one example of where like you're talking about something and you like continue the analogy, whether it's about the Eagles or it's about, I don't know, you did it a million times and I loved it because it just really like nailed home like the analogy that you were trying to make or the depth of what we were currently like immersed in. And it made me more engaged as a reader, but also just it was just more interesting language because it was language that maybe wouldn't be typically used to describe something. But
Mm.
because it was embedded in the bigger analogy, like it made sense. Is that something you just do
Yeah.
naturally? Is that a skill that you learned?
I feel like it was definitely a skill that I learned because we had to read so many hundreds of books in this MFA program and um, just basically look at the skills of the different writers and look at examples. And then we would need to take someone's skill, such as that one, and then make our own version of it in a paper. And so a lot of mirroring someone else's style. Or so they'd be like, okay, we want you to write this paper, in the spirit of like Edward Abbey or,
Mm.
um, just something like that, or make this one more poetic or really concentrate this paper on beginnings and endings. And that's funny. You talk about the beginning of the book and the end of the book, because we did have a whole class on like beginnings and endings and tying things together. And so she would show us, one of my professors would show us the beginning of a chapter and the end of a chapter. And I would have never have known, but they came, it circled around all the way back, like that kind of thing. So yeah, no, I feel like they just handed us so many opportunities to learn and examples to learn from, that you just, after reading and reading and reading, you see it happen more and more. And you're like, oh, I think I could do that. I'll try it. So
Well, that's for sure one I've
thanks.
already taken from you in writing a section of my memoir the other day, and it was talking about hiking, but then I'm talking about the emotions of a kind of relationship that's sort of thrown me off kilter, and I'm talking about the topography and the like having to reorient myself and not having a map and using all this kind of analogy, like basically brainstorm some verbs related to hiking and stuff, and then incorporated
Yes.
that into my writing, and it was just like it read so much better, and so I love and also see the value of reading what other people write and noticing those patterns, and then utilizing the ones that speak to you within your own writing. Stephanie and I have a number of podcast episodes where we do like these read like a writer book clubs where we really immerse ourselves into a book as writers to figure out how did they do that? How did they make this character so engaging? How did they, approach this nonlinear like timeline or, whatever. And
Yeah.
so that was one of those things that I picked up from this book. And so thank you for that.
That's yeah. One thing I would say specific to nature writing that they really drove home with us was take the opportunity to use the landscape or the weather or
Mm.
whatever's going on in nature to reflect the heart of the character or the narrator or the person who that chapter is about. Just to like you were saying, like the topography could reflect the instability that you're feeling, or something like that. But they let the setting or the landscape reflect let the exterior reflect the interior.
I love that.
So,
That's great.
mhm.
Um, I had a couple of more things. Oh, I think my favorite, well, I have two favorite lines in the whole book. One is your own and one is a quote. So in this same conversation, when you're talking to this farmer who's, leased out this land or sold this land for the solar panels, he says, "You can't own a view." And I was just like, "Ugh, how true is that?" And
Yes.
we invest in, we think about real estate or it's sold and marketed because of, oh, beachfront property, clear views, this beautiful vistas, blah, blah,
Sure.
blah, blah. But like in reality, that's not what you're truly buying. That can all change. That's, kind of
Yes.
here and there. And so that one struck me. And also there was another one. Um, Now this is when life is having his numerous this is actually the initial like surgery.
Mm.
And you have always practical. Andrew reminded me that we didn't know if the tumor was malignant or benign. He was right. I knew better than to forecast grief. And I was like, oh no, I know that tendency so well. Like I felt so
Yes.
like convicted in the moment of like, yeah, that's where my brain goes, right? It's like
Yeah.
I already go to worst case scenario. And then how do I fix that? Because if I can fix the worst case scenario, then maybe we'll make it through, And so for you to like have just that poignant line, like I knew better than to forecast grief, I was like,
Mm.
oh, oh, I relate. As a mom, I relate. As like I really thought that was a great way to explain the kind of churning of your mind that was probably happening in that moment.
Yes, for sure. And as moms, I think that's part of our job is to kind of forecast disasters or forecast like our kids making mistakes or not bringing the right thing. Like we grow up planning and preparing for them. When they're infants, it's like, oh, we're going to need to bring diapers and we're going to need to bring like an extra outfit, and so we always have to be like planning for blow ups or whatever. But I think it's different as they get older to basically not it's not something that was inevitable that I was forecasting. It was something that was possible. But I think that's the difference, is planning for the inevitable because they're kids, but planning for the possible, that just steals your joy if it's something, steals your joy from the moment if you're planning for something that's possible, but they might never happen.
Exactly. Um, the other thing I made note of as I was reading was uh, I think I had a number of scenes that I really loved. For one, I love the chapter where you go and feed the bulls that you read to us at the reading. That's still one of my favorite chapters. And I also love the river paddling adventure where it's like before
Mm.
Esther's in the picture where it's you and the older kids. And maybe that one I
Yeah.
relate to because I've also had some river paddling adventures that have their own sense of Mother Nature coming in and doing what she wants to do with the trip.
Yes.
Um, but one story that I really thought was a beautiful depiction of the overlap that you experience in your life, of everyday life, over what is familiar to your reader as parents, um, was the calves in the bathtub. When, you've got your kids getting ready for school and all of a sudden you've got 3 calves that are coming in, the girls are curling their
Yeah.
hair, the boys are doing whatever, and it's just like all of a sudden the reader gets to see what kind of the morning routine looks like and is probably familiar to many of us with kids getting ready for school. But now we've layered ranch life on top of it.
Mm.
And,
Mhm.
I thought it was just a really great way to sort of clue a reader in who may not know this world. Granted, I have had goats in bathtubs, so I know it. Um, but it's to clue a less a reader who doesn't have that experience into like what that really looks like to layer like family life on top of ranch life or vice versa.
Yes.
So
Yes. Thank you.
I really enjoyed the chaos of that story because it runs so true for me and my experiences. And there's the silver linings of the ones that survive, and there's the bit of sadness over the ones that don't. And but you also know you've done everything you can. Like, I just really
Yeah.
related, and I had a couple of memories come back that I had forgotten about with baby goats, and both the good and the bad. And I
Yeah.
really just
Yeah.
enjoyed that depiction.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
So as we wrap up, I'm curious if you have any updates because this book ends, before you started grad school. If you want to share with our
Mhm.
listeners, where's life at now? Not life the person, but your life as a whole. What does
Yeah.
life look like
Yeah.
now? And where, are there any updates? And what's next for you as far as writing?
Yeah. Well, probably some of the biggest updates have been that our oldest daughter, Grace, got married this summer. So that has begun, and we have an awesome son in law, Jack, and we just love dearly. Um, Naomi is now an Army nurse. She did ROTC, so she's serving in the Army as a nurse now and can be stationed in Hawaii, which is amazing. We are empty nesters now with Esther as a third grader, so it's his new territory for us. Abe and Life are both still in college, working really hard. And yeah, another big one is we have a full time hired guy, one of Abe's best friends, who actually was on that river trip that you were just talking about. That was one thing that was kind of challenging was when stories had more people involved,
Yeah.
but and I had him in there, and then my professors would say, You've got too many people to follow in the story. Like you gotta pull out the ones who aren't your main characters in your book."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, that's tough." So Abe's good buddy Wyatt, who we grew up with, is now living in the old house across the field and working with us every day. He's just awesome. He and his wife Maddie. And
So your
and the
dad
other
and
really
Uncle
big
Dan
thing,
aren't there in the old house?
they're not in the old house across the field, but they're right next door. Yep.
Okay.
So they live in the house right next door to us now. Yeah. So, and the other big thing would be in the book, we had, I think, 6 different pastures we would lease each summer. And so we'd split the cows up to different places. And now we have one huge pasture, a Forest Service grazing allotment with the federal government. So it's 44,000 acres in Buffalo Peaks over in South Park. And so that's been amazing. We're in our 3rd summer of doing that. And so it's just an incredible opportunity. And we've learned so much from um, the managers, the 2 women that we've just kind of sat under as far as grazing practices and learning the grasses and rotational grazing. They're just incredible managers of the public lands. And So we go each week and ride and keep pushing cows up to the higher pastures so that they're not overgrazing the lower, easier, riparian areas. And um, yeah, it feels like a dream to be grazing there. So that's awesome.
Well, and to give
As
the
far as
listeners,
riding,
go ahead.
what's that?
Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say to give the listeners a little taste of how like writer life and ranching life don't always align. We were gonna record this last week, and then there was a
Yes,
little bit of a like ranching
yes,
emergency, that comes
yes,
up, and then life adjusts,
yes.
everyone adjusts. And so I just thought that
Hmm.
was, kind of humorous and timely for the nature of our discussion of like all of a
Yes,
sudden the heifers were calving at a time of year where they wouldn't normally, and you know, you gotta go. That's just how it is.
yes. And calving on the forest, which, it's so funny because when we're calving out heifers at home, it's like we check them at 10 at night and then at midnight and 2 in the morning. And then, right when we get up in the morning and we just baby them and are so careful. And now they're calving out in the middle of nowhere with all these predators and we're not watching them. And nobody's had any, we haven't lost any as far as we know catastrophes. But yeah, the neighbor's bull got in last December, and so it changes this fall. That's for sure. So,
So what's next
and
writing
this,
wise?
that's a great question. People have asked me, "Oh, do you want to write another book?" And it feels like kind of a busy time still, with this book. But I have some ideas of things that would be fun to write, but I haven't started yet. And I one thing I would love to do is maybe do some local writing, maybe about agriculture, like maybe I don't know, Mountain Meal or something like that, but just a little, glimpse into what's going on the ranch and kind of agriculture and just the times, what's happening this month or this week or something like that. That would be fun for me. I would like that.
Very cool. Well, Laura, thank you for being here. We'll have a link for the table
Thank you.
in the show description. It's been so great to get to talk to you about this book, to kind of be immersed in your life through this book. And just thank you so much for being here. And I really know the listeners will take away some key tidbits about juggling of the writing or specific tips or the way to integrate in nature into their writing. So thank you for sharing your story
Yes.
with us today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It was great to be here.